So today's session is the first in the series that's about how to have a conversation, how to join the great conversation. And today it's what science really is, what reality really is, and why that's foundational to conversation. So let me introduce our spring training coach. Stephen Jonathan Rummelsburg has been a school teacher for 30 years. He's taught nearly every grade from kindergarten through 12th. So that's like practically homeschooling if you've seen all the grades, right?
Yep.
And currently teaches logic and humanities at John Adams Academy, a classical school with a mission to restore America's heritage.
Yes.
He's on the teacher advisory committee at the Sophia Institute, where he writes curriculum. He's a senior fellow at the American Principles Project. He was a senior contributor to the Imaginative Conservative and has written also for Crisis Magazine, the Catholic Exchange, and the Integrated Catholic Life. And with all this education experience, he's become a fan of homeschooling, and I think that that's going to be apparent in our sessions today.
Yes. As Misty said, I've been a teacher for 30 years, and I have learned many important things about education that have the potential to help all of you as homeschooling moms and dads. The theme here in these next 3 weeks is going to be on how to have great conversations about the great conversation. This is a bigger topic than you might think, and I want to give you just a few preliminary thoughts before we dive in. There are countless reasons why what I'm going to share here is difficult to talk about these days. Hopefully, we will come to understand some of the more important reasons. The lens through which we must see and understand the modern world and modern education is older than the universe and written into the cosmos. It is no less than seeing through the eyes of the Creator. At least that is our highest ideal. Since before the Garden of Eden, there's been a kind of battle between those who love wisdom, truth, goodness, and beauty, and those who think they are wise by their own lights. One of the first things we have to come to understand is this conflict and how it relates to education, because eternity is at stake. Over the next 3 weeks of spring training, our goal will be to develop an understanding. This week, we're going to talk about science. Next week, we'll talk about art. And in the final week, we'll talk about nature. By clarifying the distinctions between what we know, which is science, and what we are to do, which is art, and what inevitably follows by nature, we will then be in a position to properly prepare our homes for edifying and fruitful discussions. I encourage all of you to listen carefully and to write down questions about topics you would like clarified for our discussion later. So let's have a look at the summary of what I hope to accomplish today. If you guys can see this slide, this next slide. These are the prerequisites for entering the great conversation. This is hugely ambitious. I put this up there and I showed my wife and she said it was too much, but I'm hoping we can get through this in under an hour. I have a timer going on here too. So the first thing I would like us to do is to know and embrace the principle of non-contradiction. I would also like us to know and embrace the supernatural worldview. I'm hoping we can know and embrace the four causes and know and embrace the art of making proper definitions, where I'm hoping to define the human person and science. Then we can recognize the hierarchy of being and recognize the proper order of the sciences. If we can take these 6 prerequisites and embrace them, then we will be able to be prepared to enter into the great conversation. And there's a guy named Robert Maynard Hutchins, and he wrote a book called The Great Conversations because he was the editor of a series of classics, great books that was put out a while back. And here's how he describes it. He says, the tradition of the West, it began at the dawn of history and continues to the present day. This great conversation I'm speaking about is unique. It's a modern term denoting something very important about mankind and our history of thought and civilization. The Great Conversation is a feast for the soul, and it's a wonderful answer to that ageless question. If you could have a dinner party and invite anyone in history, who would you invite? Now, in this day and age, this could go many ways. I mean, if you wanted to meet Madonna or Lady Gaga, that wouldn't get you into the Great Conversation. But if you were to invite great souls like Homer, Herodotus, or Cleopatra, or Alexander the Great, souls who are part of the Great Conversation, you would then have the potential to enter into it yourself. But the Great Conversation is not an egalitarian affair. Very few actually participate in it, even though we are all. But most of us decline because there are requirements to attend. These requirements are the topics of our next 3 weeks of formation. So first off, we must come to understand that the Great Conversation is the matrix or the womb in which an authentic liberal arts education is formed. Much of the Great Conversation is conveyed by the classics in the Western canon. The prerequisites for entering into the Great Conversation are intellectual and moral habits of being that comprise the intellectual and moral virtues. These are best cultivated by the 7 liberal arts. In this talk today, we will learn about a set of principles that will not only prepare us for a much better homeschooling experience, but will even prepare us to take part in the Great Conversation, and this will translate into much better conversations at home. So we are going to begin at the beginning. We are going to begin with the first principle of all reality. We want to know everything, but by nature, because we are finite beings, we can't know everything, so we have to begin somewhere. We must begin with first principles and the Summa genre. So you might be wondering, what is a first principle? And hopefully this slide will help you see what it is. A first principle is a basic proposition or an assumption that can be deduced from any other that cannot be deduced from any other proposition or assumption. It is a self-evident proposition from which we start to reason properly. In philosophy, first principles come from the first cause. For Aristotle, the first cause is the uncaused cause, or the prime mover, or the unmoved mover. This is very, very important for us to understand. What Aristotle called the first cause, we call that God. And this is our very first question. Is there a first cause? Is there a prime mover? Is there a creator? If we get this wrong, we get everything wrong. So this formation begins with the Aristotelian assumption that there is indeed a prime mover, a first cause, the creator of the cosmos. And from that creator, a coherent and ordered reality exists, and we are able to discover and articulate the nature of that reality because that is how we are made. So let us begin with the first principle of all reality. This is our real starting point. This first principle of all reality is called the principle of non-contradiction. When Aristotle calls this the first principle of all reality, he means that this is the ground for every intelligible apprehension, every intelligible thought, and every intelligent conversation, or at least all those conversations that aim at the truth. There are 3 forms of the principle of non-contradiction: the ontological, the logical, and the psychological. This could get a little confusing here. So let me define. Ontological is the study of being. That means what actually exists. So the logical is what is in our minds, and the psychological is what is subjective and personal to us. So the ontological is a little bit complicated at first, but it goes like this. So I'm going to quote Aristotle from his Metaphysics, and I'll quote him. He says, it is impossible, the principle of non-contradiction goes like this. It is impossible that the same thing can at the same time both belong and not belong. We can simplify this a little bit for the sake of intelligibility for the moment as we look at all 3 formations on this next slide. So let's make that simpler. What I just said, what I just gave was the ontological formulation of the principle of non-contradiction, and it's easier understood today maybe as something like, something cannot be a thing and not be a thing at the same time under the same conditions. Okay, that should be fairly obvious. The logical formulation is the opinion that opposite assertions are not simultaneously true is the firmest of all. It should be easy to say that for us to say, yes, it is, and no, it isn't at the same time, logically, doesn't make any sense. That should be very obvious to us. Now, psychologically, Aristotle claims that it's impossible for anyone to believe that the same thing is and is not. This was Aristotle 2,300 years ago. These are different times today. The modern world rejects this today, and it is a thing most of us don't even realize. What we seem to realize even less is that those who reject the principle of non-contradiction, they rely on it to reject it. It's truly like sawing off the branch on which you sit. The truth is, you can't have a real conversation with someone who rejects it. It's the first prerequisite to embark upon an authentic education and to enter into the great conversation. That it is okay to hold two contradictory positions at the same time, or that it is okay to disagree with someone and both have their own truth. I have my truth, you have your truth. Even though we disagree, we can both be right. That's what the modern school says, and this is hugely problematic. An example of our modern rejection of this principle comes from one of America's favorite poets. Let's look at his quote. This is Walt Whitman in the aptly named Song of Myself. He says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." So Whitman here expresses what most people believe today, that we are so large that we can hold two contradictory positions, or even that we can disagree with others and both be right. Sadly, we're even taught implicitly that holding two contradictory positions is a sign of erudition, or as Whitman suggests, a largeness of soul. In real terms, quite the opposite is true. To attempt to hold two contradictory positions is called cognitive dissonance, and it leads to great confusion in spite of appearances. It is an expression of subjectivism which rejects the nature of objective reality, and we're going to talk more about that later. Now, in my day job, I'm a teacher coach, and I go into many classrooms. I do this all the time, and I wanted to give an example of how I approach the principle of non-contradiction with new students in high school. So by way of clearing this, I'd like to give you an example exactly what I do. I go into a new classroom, a group of scholars I've never seen before, okay? And I tell them I'm going to give them an easy quiz. I ask them two questions, and I write them on the board. I write, number one, should we respect all opinions? And number two, do you believe absurd things? Almost every time I do this, the same thing happens. The vast majority of scholars unanimously say yes to the first question and no to the second. I tally the numbers on the board, and it usually looks like this. In a classroom of 30, 30 say, yes, we should respect all opinions, and 30 say, no, of course I don't believe absurd things. And then I tell them, I disagree with you. I don't think we should respect all opinions. There's a moment of panic. Their eyes roll. They get excited, and righteous indignation ensues. They sit up and say, "What? Wait, you disagree? We shouldn't respect all opinions?" And a little bit of pandemonium follows. When they settle down, I write the principle of non-contradiction on the board, the easy version I gave you. I also write the definition of the absurd, which is on this slide here. For the definition of the absurd, something is absurd if it explicitly affirms what it implicitly denies. Think about that. A thing is absurd if it explicitly affirms what it implicitly denies. After I write that and the principle of non-contradiction on the board, I say this. If one says all opinions ought to be respected and then rejects the one who disagrees with that, one is explicitly affirming respecting everyone, but implicitly denying it by rejecting the one who disagrees with him. And that is a contradiction. And as they come to realize what they have just said, most scholars in high school get both questions wrong in the beginning, but very quickly they come to realize the mistake because this first principle is self-evident to young people. My experience is that the older people get, the more difficult it is to grasp. But I have no doubt that the homeschooling community gets this. Scholars today have embraced this absurdity, and it's no surprise because we hear this and similar absurd messages incessantly. Like the Harvard Magazine article calling for a presumptive ban on homeschooling. They want to ban homeschooling because the schools teach tolerance. You see the contradiction. They won't tolerate homeschooling because homeschoolers are not tolerant enough. So even though we haven't thought much about it, there are many contradictions we are asked to hold and believe that are not only contradictions, but absurd as well. I encourage all of you to study more about the principle of non-contradiction and to recognize it as the first principle of all reality and to pass that on to your children.